What's up everyone and welcome to another YouTube video. In this video I will show you the one game I played against Magnus Carlsen in online chess. This was played in Title Tuesday of May 2017, and before this round Magnus was leading with 6 out of 6 and I was in second with 5.5 out of 6. So this was way before everyone was streaming and before Magnus signed exclusively with Chess24. So he would sometimes play on chess.com in Title Tuesdays. And back then, Title Tuesday was also a monthly event, not a weekly event. So anyway, without further ado, Magnus opened the game up with the move 1b3, and I played d5, bishop b2, and bishop to g4. And here, Magnus unfortunately pre-moved the move e3. I took his queen, and he resigned. So that's what happened. Just kidding. Magnus did not play e3. He played the move g3. I played bishop h3, he pre-moved bishop g2, I took his bishop, and then I took the rook on the next move, so Magnus resigned. Just kidding, that's also not what happened. I played the move e6, bishop g2, knight f6, knight f3, knight bd7, just developing normally, taking a Slav setup. He played c4, I played c6, castles, bishop d6. All pretty standard so far, so he went d3, castles, knight bd2, queen e7, h3, and I played bishop to h5. So this is all pretty standard. Both sides are just developing their pieces. So Magnus played a3, trying to expand with b4, and I played a5. Rook e1, rook fe8, he played queen to c2, and I played h6, making sure I can never get back rank checkmated. And here Magnus played e4, I took, he took with the knight, I took, and here he took with the rook, which was slightly surprising, but it makes sense. Maybe he wants to, put pressure on the e-file. So I played bishop to g6, hitting the rook, and he played rook to e3. So after rook e3, I played bishop c5, and here I thought I was doing great, because I thought his rook had to go back, then I go like queen d6, hitting this pawn, and if I get in e5 and stop white from expanding with d4, black should have a pretty good position. But after the move bishop c5, he played queen c3. Now, this move surprised me. Now he's not hanging his rook, because if I take, oops, you get checkmated on g7. So I played queen f6, blocking, the attack of the queen on g7. And here he played d4. Good move, hitting my bishop, so I played bishop to f8. And he played rook a e1. And here it's clear that white is a very good position. He has a lot of space in the center. All his pieces are active. And what's annoying for black is that I can't ever really move this rook, because then I will always leave this pawn hanging. So instead of that, I played bishop to h5. He went queen to d2, and I traded on f3 and played queen to d8. So I was trying to be solid here. I thought, okay, if I can go knight f6 on the next move, it will be difficult for white to do something, even though he is better because he has the two bishops. So Magnus played d5, and this is what you always want to do when you have the two bishops. You want to open up the position. So I took on d5, he recaptured, and I played knight to b6. So hitting the pawn on d5, and Magnus played queen to d1. And here things are tricky. By the way, note that he cannot take an e6 because that would leave the queen hanging. So he played queen to d1, and here things are very tricky for black. I can never take on d5 because then he takes, and if I take, my rook on e8 is hanging. And including this trade does not work either. So again, the rook on e8 gets lost, and black's down a rook, and it's just time to resign. So instead of that, I played the move bishop to c5. Hitting the rook on e3, he dropped the rook back, and I played queen to g5. Trying to be tricky here, because if white takes here, I can suddenly take this pawn. He cannot recapture, because that would, put his king in check. So things are starting to get tricky. So he played king to g2, getting out of this diagonal, and now I played rook e to d8. So I step out of this pin, and I create a pin of my own. And around here I started noticing that Magnus was getting low on time. I felt like I should still be in trouble, but it was clear that he did not know exactly what to do. So he played rook to e5, I played queen to g6, he played queen to c1, hitting my bishop, and I played rook a to c8. Now, white can still not take on e6 because I take on f2. Hitting the queen, hitting this, hitting the rook, so here white's in trouble. So instead of that, he played queen to f4, now I just take the pawn. So he took, and I took. And here I was like, okay, I'll pawn up. But at this point I was getting pretty nervous, because I mean, if you're playing Magnus Carlsen and you're up a pawn, you know, you feel like you have the chance to beat him. So I think pretty much everyone just starts getting nervous. He played queen f3, I played b6. I was like, oh shoot, I hung this pawn. But fortunately I had this move queen to c2. Hitting this pawn over here and hitting the bishop. So white has to go bishop d4, saving the bishop and interposing the black's bishop threat on f2. So I took on b3, now I'm up a clean pawn. He went rook e3, queen b5. Played h4, I gave a check, king over, and b5. So I'm a clear pawn up, but it's not easy to convert. So he played rook to e5, I played queen to b7, queen d3. I thought, okay, let's push my pawn, let's go b4. Oh, shoot. Well, I just hung the pawn there. Now, if I go b3, that doesn't really help because he goes rook to b5, hitting my queen and hitting the pawn. So instead of that, I just traded on a3, he recaptured. Played queen to b6, trying to be sneaky, but of course he saw it. And here, I just moved my queen around, went here, queen e6, queen f3, queen f6. Once again, I think this was, we're both playing on second, so I was just, you know, moving my queen around, not trying to flag. He took, but of course his endgame has to be a draw. He went rook to d7, rook f8, king here, rook f5. Slightly odd what I'm doing here, because after this, my rook is forced into a passive position. But of course, in a 3 versus 3 endgame, there's nothing really that can happen. He went g4, went king f8, rook b7, I played rook f4. But that being said, when you play Magnus is known for grinding out these kind of endgames, but the position is really too limited for even for him to ever do anything. So king g3, just move my rook across, went here, played rook here, played king here, just kept shuffling the rook around. You know, I just wait. I mean, maybe I can trade rooks, but the rook endgame should be a draw, so I decided to just give a check with the king up, rook here, king up, here, hit the pawn, give a check, king back, h5, move the rook back. And I mean, this endgame is just a draw. White has a slightly better pawn structure because I have an isolated pawn, but there's nothing really he can do. So he played here, just kept waiting with the rook, gave a check here, here. You started making some progress here because he got in this move g5, but there's still nothing I can do really. Play check here, check, I went here. Now, if he ever goes check, I just go king up and I go after this pawn and probably both. I mean, he can do something like this, but after this, all the pawns will be traded and it's just going to be a draw. So he played rook to b5. I went here, just waited. You know, gave a couple checks, and after g6, I played rook to c5. Gave a check, king here, here. Now black should not take here because white has checkmate. So I went king back, and after takes, I took here. He played king f3, rook here. You know, cutting the king on the 4th rank, even though everything is a draw. Played here, I just waited. And the game ended in a draw. So that was the one game I played against Magnus. I was under a lot of pressure earlier on, but later in the game I was up a pawn, so I had a chance to beat him. But after all, once again, as I was under so much pressure early on, I can't really complain about the draw. And if we have a look at the tournament standings, we see that Magnus won the tournament with 9.5 out of 10. I came in 4th, pretty decent performance, but it was kind of nice to be the only one to take half a point off of Magnus' score, ruining his perfect tournament. So yeah, that was the one game I played against Magnus in online chess. So hope you all enjoyed the video. Make sure to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below, let me know what you want to see next, and look forward to seeing you all in the next one.